God morgen, venner. Tid for API review. Uh, and that is my attempt at doing mechanical translation Norwegian to honor Frederick's request from chat. Alright, as you can see, we have a whole bunch of red, but today according to the agenda I received, we have promised that decimal star is first and possibly only. So let's get started, I guess.
I thought we scheduled this one for Thursday.
Did we?
Yeah, Imo sent out an
Yeah.
email for this one is explicitly scheduled for Thursday, and we had a different schedule for today, I thought.
Yeah, I had the same impression.
Yep. All right. It's probably simply the most recent agenda I saw, and I assumed it was today's.
Yes.
That one's
Alright.
probably going to be a big one, so that's why we've got the dedicated day.
Instead, we've got that one, this one. I wondered why so many people cared.
I think it's
that
everything except the one you just showed.
Yeah, we should.
Not the top one either.
We should start. We should start with the second one, the data validation one.
Yeah, that's what the agenda says. Now that I'm looking at the right one. Okay, so apparently first up is expand data validation attributes 77402.
Yeah, I guess I could drive this. So this is a set of proposals to extend existing functionality in system component model data annotations and to, well, add a few more attributes. So I guess we can go through them one by one. So first up is extending the range attribute, which, as you know, is an attribute that lets you validate for specific ranges. But currently these are exclusive ranges, so you specify a lower bound, sorry, they're inclusive ranges. So when you specify a lower bound and an upper bound, if the value matches either the lower bound or the upper bound, it will pass validation. So this is proposing we add two more properties that let the users control whether the lower bound is exclusive or the upper bound is exclusive.
Presumably this is mostly interesting for things like double, where it gets hard to say
Presumably.
1 iota bigger than what you wanted. Because for an int, you would
Yep,
just
that's
say
it.
add +1 or -1.
Yeah, it's exactly for floats.
Well, so for floats, you do have float.bit increment and float.bit decrement, which gets you the smallest representable value that compares greater than x or less than x.
So how can I use that in an attribute definition?
You wouldn't necessarily use it in an attribute definition, but you
Okay.
could use it in a console command line or whatever and get the actual round tripable string.
Yeah, the Boolean seems.
Yeah, I just want to be able to say 0 to less than 1. It's a typical. Or greater than 0 and less than 1.
Okay. What does range attribute
Shall we
look like?
move on?
Oh, I'm just curious what the type looks like. And I guess I can share it for the benefit of others.
I think this is fine. I just have a question on it. So this range is an inclusion, like we're checking to make sure that something is within the range. Do we have the concept of validating that something is outside of a range? I only ask because these properties would start to get very confusing if we ever wanted to extend this particular attribute in the future to basically be the inverse. You know, basically say make it exclusionary rather than inclusionary.
I would expect that this would be a different attribute. I'm guessing that this is only intended for validating intervals of ordered stuff. So if we're looking at the complement of that, we'd be looking at a completely different type.
Okay.
Right. So according to Emo's tools, which I'll believe, Uh, the types aren't called upper bound and lower bound; they're called minimum and maximum. So it seems weird that you would have minimum and maximum and then say is lower bound exclusive. It feels like we should use minimum and maximum in the property names.
Yeah, sounds good. Although lower bound and minimum isn't technically the same thing, I think we should be consistent.
Yeah, I much prefer lower and upper bound here rather than minimum and maximum. Because if you're doing minimum, then you have to consider, like you start thinking differently about negatives a lot of the time.
Well, we
I'm just
already
saying
have-
the properties are called minimum and maximum, the ones that exist.
Yeah, I think we should just opt for naming consistency, and I'm guessing users would extrapolate what that we actually mean lower bound and upper bound in this case.
I would agree. The other thing is maybe consider dropping the is, so they literally show next to each other.
Yep.
Or at least swap it, right? Say maximum is inclusive, minimum is inclusive.
Are you intentionally negating it from exclusive to inclusive there?
No, I'm just not good at reading. I'm trying to be inclusive, man. That's what I'm trying.
I think that there are some default strings that get produced here for the error messages as well. We'll need to add new flavors of those error message strings to indicate the inclusivity or exclusivity of each bound as well.
Are you suggesting that we should review those strings, or?
Nah, just I think so long as there's a note that that would be expected that there are new strings used in those cases.
Yeah, I mean, in general, like we only review APIs, right? So they almost always imply behavior
Fair enough.
changes, right? Which comes with error messages usually. Do you know what the error messages use terminology-wise? Presumably they use minimum and maximum as well, right?
I think it uses between. Must be between 1 and 2 is what it says right now. But yeah, to your point, we can just leave that as a implementation detail.
All right, so we happy with minimum is exclusive and maximum is exclusive?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
All right, next up, we have the required attribute, which essentially validates whether a specific value is null or the empty. Sorry, it fails validation if a value is either null or the empty string. This is an additional property to also validate for structs that might equal the default value for the type. So that would be an opt-in behavior.
So this is completely a no-op for reference types, right?
Correct. Yeah. It's already.
It's implicitly the always.
Sorry, you said. Yeah, that makes the name of this a little strange because if this disallowed default values is, wait, I'm getting my double negatives mixed up. If disallowed default values is false, that's what we already do today.
Yeah, for reference types. And I'm guessing we could. Sorry, go ahead.
But so this would be a breaking change then, for structs.
Only if the users opt into that flag. So currently disallow is false. So it.
Right. I guess what my point is currently the default for reference types is to allow default values, and the default for structs is to.
I think the name should reflect the fact that it's referring to default values for value types rather than null for reference types.
Yeah.
So disallow default value type.
I'll also throw in another potentially confusing thing and see how people feel about it. If it looks like the required attribute can be specified at a parameter level, where, at least with the current name of default value, it may confuse people between the syntax of optional parameters versus the zero initted struct. It also might not. But
I think maybe we might want to think of this from the perspective of supporting value types, because I believe that the current implementation of required attribute, it makes it essentially a no-op for any value type. So it might just be that we could name this, enable value types, and the behavior for value types is, fail if it happens to equal the default value for that value type.
What is the default value, however? Default itself is a C# concept, not necessarily a concept in other languages. And now that we have default struct constructors, you can define something that, Jeremy, it doesn't matter if you like it or not, people use it.
I know.
So we also have the ability for people to do new t for some value type t and have it be different from default t.
I mean, the definition is zero initted, right? That's the intent here.
Yeah.
Yep.
Would using the word empty be controversial?
Frankly, I think default is fine. It is the expectation, I think, that the default value for a struct, regardless of whether that originated from C#, is the all zero value.
How does that apply to primitive types? For example, integral 0 or floating point 0. And for floating point, how does that then apply to -0, which is not default, but which compares equal to default depending on which comparison method you use?
If you specify, default is the all zero value, regardless of the type you're talking about.
Yeah, if default of double dot equal input says true for 0 and -0, then 0 or -0 is a default value. Asking IEquatable is the only way that this would even make sense.
So there's default, there's empty. You could say all zeros, like disallow all zero value types or so.
I mean, if the type has a definition of equality that collapses everything to one thing, like it would just check if the specific instance equals the zero initted thing. It wouldn't necessarily need to be the zero initted thing.
Well, the implementation of this is just going to do equals default of t kind of thing, right?
Might
It's
need
not generic,
a
but
few more tricks because it's not generic, yeah. But essentially, it would be doing that.
The general concept of disallowing default values for any value type t is odd to me, because there's certainly types where you would there's types where the default is ill-defined, like immutable collection, for example, and then there's types where the default value is well-defined and you may even want it.
Then you don't apply that.
But you're opting in here on a specific use case which has a specific type, so you're making that choice on a case-by-case basis.
And for what it's worth, system.text.json already is doing that. It uses that as a criterion to ignore properties. There's JSON ignore condition dot when writing default, and it precisely compares whether the value to be checked equals the default value for that given type.
That's going to be buggy in the case of floating point, because that means that you are considering, for example, hash code equality, but not necessarily considering bitwise equality, which means that you are silently throwing away data and potentially changing the.
There's no hash code equality being considered here, and for what it's worth, because it's
hash
opt-in.
code. Hash code equality specifically. So the IEquatable and .NET equals in general are defined in terms of working with hash code, so that you can correctly use the T in something like a dictionary or a hash set. And so it considers things like all nans equal even if the bitwise representation of the two nans are different, or it considers +0 and -0 to be equal.
Sure.
Which is different necessarily from operator equals. But the general thing is that just because something says it's equatable to something else does not necessarily mean that it's equatable for the purposes of serialization. And so in the case of something like -0, if you were using...
I get your point, but I'm just pointing out that this is an opt-in feature and users use it at their own risk and on the presumption that they understand the equality semantics of the specific type at hand. So
and it's also like we have equality comparer.default, which is providing default comparison semantics for the T. And you're asking basically to say, does this compare with the default compare to default for that T? Yes or no? And it's up to the T. And that's it.
Yep.
Right, but so my general concern is that for something like that, people are going to say, oh, it's printing out all these zeros. I don't want to do that, so I want to save space, so they go and enable it. And if something like ML.NET went to enable it, then they end up in a scenario where they're now no longer serializing their -0s, and then their entire thing changes on behavior. And so there's no interim.
Sorry, are you talking now about JSON, or are you talking about this attribute? Because this attribute has little to do with serialization.
Yeah.
Well, Eric mentioned specifically that it was used by...
Well, but that's an existing feature. Like, we've already shipped it. It's done.
Yep.
So all that we are referring to it for is the name that we used.
It
which
just
was
seems
default.
like it seems like it's a thing where people can trivially make it end up in a giant pit of failure.
Sure, that's serialization
Because-
But
straight
hold
up.
on, I think I don't understand the failure case here. Even in the JSON serialization thing, it says if it's all 0, don't put it in the generated file, in the generated JSON. And on consumption, if it's not mentioned in the JSON, the field will be all zeros.
Well,
Negative
that's the thing
0
is,
has nothing to do with this.
that's so if it's comparing against default of T, then it is not saying all zeros. It's saying something that says I compare equivalent to, and so that is not the same thing as all
Okay,
zeros.
that's fair. That's fair.
Yes, so it depends on the equality semantics of the type and whether that collapses a specific value to be equal to the thing that is all zeros. But I think people, well, I'm not going to say that they understand the risks of using it, but I think they might understand what it might do if they enable this flag. I don't think that's particularly controversial. Now, it might provide surprising behavior. I'm not disputing that, but I think that people might want to just use it for integers, for example.
Yeah, I mean, what if we just called it apply to value types?
I think that's a good name. I think this is basically what we want to do. Retrofit the attribute so that it validates for value types.
Because, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's a little sort of silly because, like, you said, int, and you put required on it, so the only thing you could mean is it can't be default valued. And if it's object, then if you have a boxed int, it's not null. But
I think that's maybe the problem with value types in general is you can't equate the concept of required with a value type T. Because with nullable, you're saying I either have some or I have none. But with a value type, the only way to represent that same concept is with a nullable of t, or
Yeah,
some
and
option of t or something else. And so required means you must specify, and specifying 0 is still specifying something. And so you
Yep.
get into this whole thing of you're trying to say disallow or like allow value types or anything like that, but you're still providing something. And so saying required doesn't cleanly correlate over, and I think there needs to be a different concept or a different way of explaining to users exactly what it means.
from my perspective, in such scenario, I would always wrap my binding models with a nullable. But it seems that there is a requirement for us to expose this for value types as well. Like I said, I think that failing validation when something is 0 is not something I would do, but it sounds like there might be a requirement for that to happen in certain cases. I don't think that's
Sure, and I don't disagree with that. I just think that the required attribute might be the wrong attribute to do that with, and or if it was done, it should be much more explicit about the semantics it has with that. Like, for example, instead of disallow default values, it should be something more like disallow values that compare equal to the default or something. That's a bad name, but it clearly.
What is the actual?
What's the use case?
So yeah, what's the actual use case for this? How is this being used? With what types? With what goal?
Because if nullable of t is the only thing we care about, we can say, apply to nullable, and done.
Where I've seen this kind of behavior come up, and this is true for string as well, which already has special handling here, is you've got UI that's bound, and you have a strongly typed non-nullable struct or class that you're binding this stuff to, and there will be a value on that thing, but that doesn't tell you if the user has typed something in or not.
Right, but again, that's the great. You must specify a value. Is 0 not a legal value for this int, or the struct in whatever its default looking state is? Like,
right.
It is hard to, like, again, I can see as a case for nullable of t. That one is, we've defined it as nullable here just so we can track whether or not you've assigned it. And is null is not allowed for this property. And, like, that makes sense. Anything else feels like a weird... I mean, A, you'd have why would somebody put the attribute on, but B, what behavior do you really expect?
So the issue is that you want to validate. So first, the original proposal had a distinct attribute that was called default values, no default values, or something. What was it called? It was called non-default value required. So it's unambiguous name. The functionality, it's about the fact that once you start declaring things as nullable, and they're validated as not being null, then even though you validated it systematically, the type system says this could be null, and then you end up having to check elsewhere. In this case, and there's the overhead of having it's a nullable, it's actually more expensive than just having a value there. If instead I say, look, I don't want a default point, I want an actual filled-in point value, and it's always going to be there, it's always required. I don't want to have if checks, I don't want to have has value and all this crap in the rest of my code. That's the point of this. Like, the user must specify something.
In that example, when the user specifies the origin point, we say that that's illegal?
Yes. In this particular count, I don't know. I just picked point out of thin air.
But I think that's part of the problem. Is I don't agree with the concerns around the default naming, but I do agree with the concerns around conflating having specified a value with the 0 value not being legit.
But that's why it's a property. So the required by itself without this property says this value can't be null. And that should apply for reference types and value types. In addition, if you set this bit that says not only do I want this to not be null, I also don't want it to be the default. So, which is equivalent to, I don't want the string to be empty.
Right, which we do already have a property for on required attribute, allow empty strings. Is there for exactly that handling for strings.
What is the property that already exists on required attribute?
Allow empty strings, and it defaults to false.
Presumably from the rule of handle default and empty is, or null and empty string is the same.
Correct. But
Yeah,
also
then,
because
given
if
that,
you
I
bound your UI to this type, like, yeah, whatever is populating this object is going to shove a value into there, and without discrimination against those empty strings or empty values.
Given that, I think if that is actually this, like we actually have a scenario for this where we believe there are, non-trivial number of cases where you actually your domain for that type basically says that the 0 value is illegal, and it's common enough that we want to promote it to a property. I think the proposed property is fine.
Was
So a
allowed
good
empty
example of this
strings
is
there from the
we
beginning?
have it in a couple places in our line. We have a GUID. There must be a GUID.
No, it looks like the attribute came in 3.5 and the string handling came in 4.
I find it interesting that it's defaulting to false. Was that the original behavior?
One presumed. I mean, we have a BCL guideline that is poorly followed, which says treat the null string and the empty string as the same thing.
Got it.
So this was probably doing that, and then someone was like, but I assigned it. It's not null. Give me the empty string, and thus the property was born. That's before my time, so I'm guessing.
You are correct.
Could we use this property to name the new thing and call it allow value types?
Or, allow empty values, or
Well, the problem is that it currently does allow the integer 0 when this is
Well, you could
applied on
default
an
it to
integer
true.
property.
You could just default it to true.
That's true.
I think that would be better.
agreed.
Do we have any general guidance against true defaults for settings like this? In ASP.NET, we often try to avoid them, but I was wondering if that was the case in the BCL.
The trouble is many people, especially the more they know about how underlying systems work, assume that if they didn't set something that it was 0. So if we called it, allow default value types, then someone would look at that with the actual thing that means the exception proves the rule to suggest that the default is that they're not allowed. And then it's like, oh, the default of this is true. You have to set it to false. So generally, yes, we do have the, if you have to write the code, it means you're trying to change it. Or if you're looking at it, you should be changing the behavior, and it should be obvious as to why you would want to change it. But
Yes.
the real answer is it should default to the previous behavior. And
There's also a documentation gap. Right? In R9, we made it a point that every single property says default is this in the docs. And in .NET, often you have to go look at the source code. So shall we go with allow empty values, or allow default values and default it to true?
Allowable of t is technically a value type. Do we need to disambiguate?
yeah, so I mean,
Further?
somebody mentioned, it sounded like it was implied that required attribute currently rejects nullable of t if it's representing the has value false state.
It does.
So I think it's already covered and doesn't seem like this property applies to it. because what you're trying to change is the behavior for value types that are not nullable of T.
So this really is just allow default values or default value types.
Well, default value type values.
Yeah.
I mean, so, applied, like, that's my renaming the whole thing of apply to value types is maybe more.
I like the. I like that approach. It's basically changing the default behavior, which is no op, into something that actually does some kind of quote required validation for non-nullable value types.
And it's weird because, if you put it on an int field property parameter wherever, like, the only time it would do anything is if you say required, and yes, I mean it, but unless it was already throwing for this made no sense to be put on an int, then we do need people to opt into it, I guess.
Good analyzer, I suppose. Should be easily detectable.
To tell people that their existing code is about to, or is potentially going to face a world of hurt.
I'm just saying, yeah, like if they're already this case that we don't want to break, and I'm not suggesting we break it where people put a required value on a value type or a required attribute, we could highlight that as being a no app, like delete it or use this new.
Because the suggestion of just make a second attribute actually seems cleaner from a user perspective.
There's one caveat to that, which is that validation runs in 2 phases. The required attribute is processed in phase 1, and if it fails, then phase 2 of all other attributes are not processed.
Okay.
So
can you not add a new phase 1 attribute?
No, because you'll break the ecosystem of everybody that went and implemented their own equivalent of validator.
Could we derive from required attribute? Sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
Oh, I was going to ask a different question. Keep going with your line of thinking, and then I'll ask my question.
Yeah, could we derive from required attribute and create required value attribute? And technically, that would still be a required attribute, but we could detect that and, process it accordingly.
You're probably also gonna also blow up code where people are assuming there can be one in. Well, actually, is it sealed or not?
I don't believe any of these classes are sealed. Let me double check.
I was thinking we did make required sealed for that reason. No, we didn't.
It is not sealed.
We've got to allow. Okay. So. Yeah, I don't know how often folks would blow up by finding multiple required attributes.
So my question was going to be, if it's currently a no-op, if someone adds a required attribute to a value type, a non-nullable value type, they have a bug in their code. It's not doing what they expected it to do because what they expected it to do doesn't exist. Can we just make what we're talking about here be the default behavior? And yeah, some people who wrote bad code will break, but what they wanted it to do doesn't make sense anyway.
Well, I think it would be a major breaking change.
So if it's a major breaking change where that suggests that lots of people have this attribute on value type properties, what are they doing?
They just blindly applied the attribute to a bunch of things, and the code that they deployed happens to work because it's a no-op. But suddenly we start validating on numeric values passed into an API, and the API start responding with validation errors.
I mean,
and we think this is a common mistake.
In where I used to work before, that was a fairly common mistake. Like people were just copy paste required attribute everywhere, and
Right, but what if we, fix the bug, aka we don't introduce API for it, and then we leave a app compat switch for turn it off?
Is there a
I don't
chance this
know.
would fix anyone's apps? That they would have thought it was doing this already?
I don't think most people would expect that required on a int would block 0.
Yeah, because the point is nullable already does what we expect.
By the way, the
I
existing.
guess I just don't
the
know. I don't know what I
existing-
would expect required on a int would do. I don't have a built-in expectation for that.
Yeah, I mean, I assume they think it means someone must assign it, but there's no way to detect was assigned.
So what's the issue in just having a separate distinct attribute whose sole purpose is to indicate I don't want default values? It's unambiguous, it's compatible, it's trivial to implement, trivial to document.
We could. It won't run in stage 1 of validation, which would mean all of the non-required attributes will also get validated. So if somebody was trying to do this to, make sure that their other validators don't fire if the default values are there, they wouldn't gain that benefit. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And by the way, the existing implementation of validator only checks the first required attribute that it finds in phase 1. So I would guess that other people that have implemented their own equivalent validators are doing the analogous thing there.
Oh, if you put required and required value type both on the same field, that it would.
Yeah. Now it's going to be non-deterministic which one gets hit.
I assume the reason you check the required ones in the first pass is just so there's no null pointers for everybody else downstream.
Yes, and that allows every other validator to avoid having to implement also required logic. So it makes every other validator, it allows you to have optional fields that are validated against rules when they're specified. So kind of back to the, disallowing empty values here would be in the spirit of supporting that mechanism. But if we had made it so that required is validated during phase 2, then it easily leads into the anti-pattern of every other validator also having to say, is this value actually here? If so, let me validate it. And that makes it hard to model an optional field with a range attribute on it.
I keep coming back to the current proposal, maybe with a naming tweak is the right one. Disallow default value type values or whatever. It's simple. It's unambiguous. I mean, except for concerns around default, but I think default's okay. It's very clear, and it's opt-in.
How about disallow all default values?
And okay, so if you set that to false, then it just disallows null.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it disallows null and default values.
Yeah, every default value that exists in the type system.
I think that's reasonable.
That's clean.
It does do. I mean, there's an interesting caveat to that, which is you can implement equality on a reference type to compare equally with null. Do we do that check today?
Unity does that extensively.
So if we went with all, I would expect that in addition to checking null for reference types, we'd also do an equality compare to null.
So if you've specified that and it's a reference type, then it calls instance.equal null, and if that returns true, then it bails.
Personally, that would be my expectation given that name. I'm not saying we should have that behavior if it doesn't make sense, but that name suggests that to me.
Tanner, would the Unity types compare unequal to null?
So Unity has this thing where for the editor, they will sometimes basically they basically dispose the object for lack of a better corollary example, but they basically dispose the object. The instance still exists, but for the purposes of the editor and other things, if you were to compare it against null, it would say, yes, I am null. And then you are supposed to treat it as if it was actually null, even if it's not literally null.
My expectation is that we should just respect the equality semantics given to the equals method of the given object.
I think maybe one of the considerations, however, is that there's always there's cases where you do want those to be equivalent, and there's other cases where they are equivalent for convenience, but not necessarily for purposes of computation.
I mean, there's also another easy answer, which is you say you don't care and you make your validator throw that you can't specify this on a reference type, which is what you should have done in the validator for value types previously. Things that don't make sense should be exceptions. That way you can fix the bug later.
Yeah, because like the biggest concern I have with just relying on the equality is if you have something like an immutable collection where default is basically null, and where it is distinct from empty, which is an actual allocation and empty thing. But then you also have types like float, where +0 equates to -0. However, they do not produce equivalent results when using them in computation. For example, dividing x by +0 gives you a different result than dividing x by -0. For example, you will get positive versus negative infinity, which are very different results and completely change your input domain for the rest of your computation. So even though they compare equivalent, they are not treated equivalently in all cases. And it's not safe to assume that equivalence means that you can, one-to-one drop them in for each other.
I don't think these cases. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not particularly concerned by that. Like, if a user creates a struct where the equals method returns true for every input, I think that's on them.
This isn't a case of...
We use a quality compare. So we use a quality compare throughout the .NET ecosystem, and we compare. And regardless of the type, we end up using a quality compare of t.default to do an obscene number of things. I don't see how this is particularly special, and it's opt-in. You basically say, I want this behavior, I want this default equality semantic, so I opt into it, I get what I ask for. Let me rephrase my question or rephrase my comment. What is it that you would propose, Tanner?
We invent a time machine and we fix it so that equality for floating point types doesn't do that. And then 90% of the concern goes out the window.
Okay, so obviously we can't do that. What are you proposing now?
I mean, if the float types are literally the only problem, then if we care, we can special case them to say that -0 is not 0.
Well, it's not just the float types. It's the float types and any struct that contains a float. Because the
assuming they wrote a default implementation of doing default equality.
Well, the runtime one takes into account. It takes it into account for equals and hash code to be correct.
Yeah, but if they followed the guidelines, then they wrote that every struct they wrote I-equatable, and they wrote the equality operator themselves.
Yeah, and then they've got a bug that we end up having to go fix because then it doesn't work in a collection.
I'd throw this into the same category of, so we've got allow empty strings. This is pretty similar to what about strings with white space in them?
Yeah.
If you're allowing your model to get populated with ever so slightly not refined, not sanitized data, that's kind of on you. So I would say if your model population is allowing -0, +0, and all those different permutations of ever so slightly incorrect, you got to do some sanitation of your model before you run it through validator, just like you do with strings.
The difference is that whereas you could say that that an empty string and a white space are the same, you might also say they're different. And so validate.
That's my point. Is it's on you to sanitize that data before you run it through your validator.
Right, but there might not be any sanitation.
Then don't use this attribute.
Right, but then you have the pit of failure of how do users know? How many
documentation. We're making a mountain out of a molehill here.
Yeah. Like, I think if we insert the word all, you decide in the implementation what you're going to do about reference types, whether you're going to call equality or you're going to throw of don't specify this on reference types. And then we document what it does, and it's an opt-in, and if we need a new feature in another 5 years, then we add another feature in another 5 years. Honestly, my preference is we just fix the bug. We make it apply to value types, and we break people. But I'm guessing, based on that that the feature team doesn't agree. But anybody who wants to use this feature now has to say required, and I mean it, and that seems stupid. But so yes, don't allow stupid states to be no-ops. That's the lesson from this, people. Not like you, like 6 people on the call, like internet people. Everyone. Don't fall through to default, fall through to throw. Alright, so any objections to disallow all default values?
One last question here about when having a num with default member inside it, which happens to be not 0.
Enums have a you mean so you made the word default be not 0?
Yes.
I don't think we can.
I just is this a concern or we don't care?
This would be the same value as default of T in C# or whatever the equivalent construction is in other languages. Which means 0, not whatever value you gave to the word default.
Yeah, I'm just mentioning it because the word default will be confusing at that time, but maybe it doesn't matter much.
I mean, if we wanted to be super accurate, we'd say disallow 0 initted values, but then now we have the problem of negative float of how do we detect 0 initted. There's no runtime helper that I know of does this look like a 0 initted value, which we could do with span and memory tricks, except you can't take a pointer to a thing if it contained reference types. I mean, we might be able to because we're special and evil, but I don't think that it's something that can be replicated by third-party implementations.
So we do have the concept of bitwise equatable. And we have the concept of being able to do operations if it is bitwise equatable. And so you do have the ability to go and say, is everything in this, actually initialized to 0?
Does that allow types that contain references?
No, because those aren't bitwise.
Right, which means that this attribute then blows up. We need a thing that can be described to people. If the implementation should say that things that are bitwise equatable should use the bitwise helper instead of the equal, then that's fine. It can do that, and then it can be documented. But I think we're done with the name, unless anyone disagrees.
So what's the final name?
I inserted the word all. So disallow all default values.
Oh, I thought we wanted to be in the positive since there's already allow something.
Allow empty strings is there, so.
Right, but again, allow empty strings was you need to go specify this if you don't like that they're not allowed by default. So this is right now default value event is allowed, and so you're writing down I want you to disallow this.
I can buy that. And it's not like we've got a sea of properties that folks have to navigate through here as well. It's allow empty strings is literally the only property. So
what's going to happen if the user specifies required attribute on a reference type and then specifies disallow default values false?
Say that again, please.
The user puts required attribute on a reference type and then says disallow default values false. which means that they have said specifying a reference type is required, but also that specifying null is allowed.
No, because now it's called disallow all default values, and then it would be you don't
Yes, but
hit the
same
intersection case. No, it's you apply to the base behavior.
But you're saying disallow all default values false.
Sure. That means you're only disallowing the default values that were previously supported by the required attribute.
Yep.
Therefore, you're allowing some default values.
Yeah. Not necessarily the ones that apply to your type, but some default values. Yeah, I think it's fine. And it's not like this is a mainline feature anyway. Like, you're in the world of validators, you're reading the validator documentation, you need to understand how they work. And I think that avoiding the phrase value type values by using all sounds like it just solves all of our problems.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where documentation
Yeah.
will actually explain what this is doing. The name, you couldn't possibly
But
put it in the name.
yes, in all seriousness, you really need to figure out what you want the behavior for reference types to be when this is set. Of, do we want to do the unity checking if it's equivalent to null, or just throw if it's applied on a reference type? But please think it through so we don't have to do this again. That is a personal request. Alright, base 64 string.
Yeah, so as the name suggests, this would be applied to string properties, validating whether these are valid base64 string representations according to our own convert implementation for, well, reading base64 strings.
We've had, I think the UTF-8 one doesn't allow white space, but the convert one does, or they disagree on what white space is. Do you need knobs in V1 about white space handling? Or is that down to the realm of custom validation now? And are you allowing white space?
So what does base 64 dot is valid going to do?
I remember we had a long discussion about that because convert from base 64 string and UTF-8 base 64 converter didn't do the same thing. I don't remember where we landed.
Right, so the main use here is somebody's typing something in a config file and it gets parsed here.
Yeah, I mean, if your answer is you're matching whatever convert does, then sure. Which is white space is allowed, possibly even all the white space that's supposed to be allowed is allowed. And yeah, I remember that we've had issues about white space, at least I assume it's issues with white space with base 64, and so I'm just asking, do you need knobs, or are you good with it being just a blank attribute?
I think I wasn't aware that there were discrepancies, but now that you're pointing it out, I'll take a note of kind of validating for the union of the two valid inputs. But I'm guessing it really depends, and I think that's a question for you, Martin. It really depends on what method you are planning on. Would you expect that a validated string would be passed to? Would it be passed to the convert from base 64 string method or something else? If it's expected to be passed to the convert method, then maybe we should just validate for that.
Yeah, that's my expectation in most cases, and in general, I tend to prefer the stricter. There's not supposed to be spaces in base 64, so it's going to validate as false, and then you can always add a Boolean property later to say relax the constraint.
Well, base 64 definitely allows new lines.
Yeah, new lines, of course. Yeah.
I don't remember how it feels about other white space. I'm pretty sure the RFC says space and carriage return and new line and maybe tab and are all permitted. The base 64 likes... Oh, no, white space has to be permitted because base 64 comes out of email, and email when you would be replying would end up with prepending white space. So yeah, it definitely allows it in the middle of the block. So yes, white space is allowed by default. For convert from base 64 string. I'm
Okay.
98% sure about that.
All right.
And
Well,
if
follow those semantics, that's fine with me.
okay, and is that name gonna conflict with anything weird? There's a non-public thing. Okay, so no. So base 64 string is currently not otherwise in use. All right. No feedback on that one. So length.
Right. So essentially, this just would be applied to properties containing strings or some IEnumerable, and it would be validating that its length falls within the specified range. Both the lower bound and the upper bound are optional.
You really mean an IEnumerable? Like you're
Yeah.
gonna in the validator drain an enumerable?
Yes, because the expectation is that you're validating against a binding model that has just been deserialized. So 99% it's going to be an I collection of T.
And then, oh yes, returning to the notion of don't allow ambiguous behavior, please throw if base 64 string is applied to something other than a string.
Of course.
In case you want to open it up later. Similarly for length, if it's applied to a thing that you don't understand.
I guess that will depend on the current conventions in data annotations, which Jeff might be able to answer. I'm not sure what the behavior is if you misapply an existing validation attribute. Like, are we throwing, or is it just a no-op?
We wouldn't throw for sure. I forget if it returns error or not, or something like that.
Well, making it return error will stop people from using it in a bad way. So don't allow, don't fall back into the previous, we let default go through and now we'd like to change that behavior of don't let stupid be success.
Should this be count instead of length? The language concept is over count, and count applies to everything, including arrays and spans via the extensions, whereas length only applies to arrays and spans, technically speaking.
And strings.
Strings.
Yeah, and strings.
This is in alignment with the existing min length and max length validators. It's essentially a composition of those two. So it's and in the validation space, this is what length is used across all platforms that I've studied validation frameworks.
If there's already a min length and a max length, why do we care to add a new one?
Because it's super annoying having to do both, and then you have to have two different error messages. So by doing a single length, it can validate both things and give you a single error message so that you can tell the user what the min and the max are in one shot. Whereas right now, the user experience is you provide a value, you're expecting a minimum of 5 and a maximum of 10. You give it 3, you get a message that needs to be at least 5. You give it 13, and you get a message that needs to be at most 10. So this just convenient composition of them.
One of the reasons we added a separate attribute also in R9 is because the standard attribute only supports the min length attribute only supports non-generic array or string. So it's not very flat on .NET Framework. So that was a limitation that since we needed to work across on legacy frameworks, we needed the separate attribute.
How does this handle enumerables or other data that can be longer than int?
I mean, if your integer is, if your upper bound is an integer, then I'm guessing it would fail validation if it enumerates past that.
And if it's only checking min, it doesn't necessarily have to drain the whole enumerable. It can stop once it's exceeded min.
And if you got an enumerable with more than 2 billion values, this is probably not the right attribute to use.
So your use of default values in the constructor here
It's precisely
confuses
to
me.
account. Yeah, it's to account for the fact that it's an attribute. The parameters can't be nullable, and therefore the max length needs to be -1 to signal the fact that it's unspecified. So -1
but
signals.
the fact that there are defaults at all, like maybe max length being defaulted seems reasonable, but like why can you just say length?
Because you might want to specify a minimum length and a maximum length.
No.
Maybe I'm
Why?
not getting the
Like
question.
with them both being defaulted, you could just put length. That's the
what
same
if-
as not specifying it. So why is that legal syntax?
If you were able to specify just one, then you wouldn't be able to specify a range.
No, sorry. Like, get rid of this equals 0 is most of my suggestion.
Yeah.
Don't default the minimum.
Got it. So separate constructor just for the max length.
No, you can default the max length, just don't default the min length.
Yeah.
With them both
that's
being
based on-
defaulted, you can specify nothing, and specifying nothing is the same as not having the attribute. So don't do that.
Yeah. I mean, you'd need to specify a 0 if you didn't want to say as an upper bound, but I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Lower bounds, rather.
How does this work with multidimensional arrays?
They're enumerable.
Should not.
So whatever that syntax means.
And why max length is nullable type? I mean, I'm not getting this one.
Yeah, so there's a discrepancy between the constructor parameters and the properties because you can't actually pass a nullable literal in an attribute annotation, so it needs to be an integer.
But can't we just have that return array dot max length, and or in the case it's a collection type, have it return int dot max value instead?
Well, but
Since that's the implicit.
you're the one who asked about things that could exceed int.max value, so
Yeah, it should be possible to specify values larger than array.max length, I think.
Would it be cleaner to require both and be like use max length or min length attributes if you want to only set one bound?
I was thinking the same thing. The only reason I've seen for wanting to do this is that then if you are programmatically constructing your attributes based on some other model, it can make that programmatic creation of your validation attributes easier, but I see that a whole lot less in .NET than I've seen on other platforms.
Should these just be called minimum and maximum to match what we have on range? Since the length is implied via the attribute type name.
Yep.
Should the ints just be longs? Very little cost, and it addresses the collections longer than 32 bits.
That makes sense to me.
Sure.
emo,
I think one issue.
do we care about CLS here?
Does anybody care about CLS?
Long is CLS compliant, but also we can't care about CLS because basic C# features don't take CLS compliance into account anymore.
Sure, but I don't know if what we feel about the model for attributes and if attributes themselves have special handling. That's why I defer to emo.
It'd be inconsistent with min length and max length attributes, but other than that,
It's a more capable version.
Yeah.
I would think so.
one drawback of requiring a max length value to be set is that it would necessitate enumerating to the end to validate that it doesn't exceed that max length, even if you only care about the minimum length.
Then use the min length attribute. Yes. That was the statement, is there's already a one for minimum and one for maximum. This is just for collapsing the two into one thing. If you only have one, use the existing ones.
Yep.
Yep.
But what if you want the min length to be greater than int.max value? Then you need to use this new type. No, I'm just kidding.
Then, well, yeah, so if we change it to long, then they could certainly have a convention that says long.max value doesn't get validated because they can't count that high. So
the original one, the original proposal here I had two different constructors, one that just takes a min length, and one that takes both. And then you can
for
express
attributes,
your property.
we basically only allow you one constructor. Anything that's optional should be a settable property.
Why is that?
I don't know. It's how attributes work.
No
Rules? No, I mean it's literally how we always do attributes in the BCL. So, rules.
Okay, so there's no practical problem you doing that because it works just fine. So I'd love to understand why, but.
I mean, it's just our convention for attributes is required things go in the constructor as required properties, and optional things are only specified as the property syntax.
I'm guessing you don't really need the
So I guess
constructor
you can overload only if it is we take a string or an int.
And I'm guessing that if you only needed to pass one argument, you could just use either the min length or the max length attributes that do the dedicated thing.
Right. Alright, and then we're renaming those properties to minimum and maximum.
I mean, should we try to make it a bit consistent with the existing attributes? They do contain, both of them have a length property, so should these be reflected here somehow?
I mean, the suggestion of renaming them from min length and max length to minimum and maximum was to make them look more like range. So we have to pick which thing we're being consistent with because they're not inherently consistent.
Well, I mean, these are closer to min length and max length as opposed to range in this case. And for what it's worth, the existing attributes only accept integer lengths. So, do we want to preserve this or make it use long for the new one?
I like long. More capable, kind of said.
Yeah, it's more capable, and if people need it, then they can always use this attribute instead of the other one, even if it's just one.
What do you mean, even if it's just one?
So today they have with the introduction of this attribute, they'll have the option of using either min length and max length, or length if they need both. And if they needed just one of them, like just min, then they could use just min, or they could use length and then specify max length as -1. But if we make this long and they have a scenario that needs long, then that also supports the min and max case, because they can still use it here and just default the one they don't care about.
Okay, you mean one of the two, not 1L. I was like, why would you care if it's 1L? Because it's an attribute syntax. It's just one. So. But you meant only minimum or maximum, which I guess makes sense. All right, so we're making them long. I guess it's not what we normally do, but it sounds like what people want.
Should they be unsigned?
No.
I mean,
No.
if you
That's
technically, yes. Do we ever use unsigned integers for links? No. So,
Okay.
We throw. If so, if I'm understanding things correctly, we're making both arguments required, but we preserve the behavior of if a negative value is passed to max length, we treat that as infinity.
if you want. And then the question is, are you keeping it as long question mark to show a negative value was passed, therefore you should treat it as if no value was passed, or do you just want to be long and let the validators deal with negative numbers themselves?
My vote is long.
Because remember that anybody who's validating it based on a source model or a reflection model and not a live instance model can't see how you default that property. They can only see the values passed to the constructor or property setters. So if you wanted to make it optional, then it would generally be... Oh, and that's why we don't do... or why we do that syntax, so that you can know what to do in a reflection-based processing. The... yeah, if we made it where there's only one parameter, but just made this get set, then it becomes... Did you give me one? Or we can... Because your negative turns to null, or your negative is just passed through. Like, you're gonna...
But now you essentially have min length attribute with an additional property attached to it. Could we consider that instead?
Yeah, because like length 5 being the minimum length is 5 is not necessarily intuitive. But I don't think we have to go to the back of the drawing board adding to min length. I don't know.
It feels weird to have a max length property hanging on a thing called min length attribute. But
Exactly.
Oh, yeah,
So, like,
looks good to me.
Yeah, and then this will just have the behavior that -1 means disabled. We'll leave it at that.
well, for whatever validation engine that we control, negative numbers would mean not validated. Turns out it's just an attribute, so if anybody else is using it, they get to interpret negative numbers however they want.
Sure.
We can document the
Point is,
negative
we're not
numbers mean
gonna-
not validated, but
Right. The point is we're going to allow it. We're not going to say that, like, oh, you have to pass in positive values to these things.
yeah.
Uh,
Well,
I'm
yeah.
trying to-
Attribute constructors shouldn't throw because the IL generated them. Reflection models see them. It's the only time that you would see the throw is if you use the reflection instantiation of them.
Yeah, I should say, like, it wouldn't necessarily be in the constructor. Our validators would not
Oh, yeah.
throw up on it.
Our existing attributes to throw invalid operation exception if you give a negative length for min or max.
In their constructor? Or
Or
in the validator engine?
in the validator engine.
Okay.
Well, sort of. It's when the attributes dot is valid is called. So yes, by way of the engine.
Right, so, yeah. Asking the reflection object model of give me instances of all the attributes that were applied to this isn't going to throw that one of those constructors through. Okay. All right. And so are we leaving the names as is?
Oh, yeah. I see now the special case of -1 for max though. So yeah, just making sure the behavior matches existing ones is good.
Because there's minimum, maximum, min length, max length, minimum length, maximum length, potato and carrot.
Minimum value, maximum value.
Yes, no? It was suggested.
Sorry,
No
I might have
strong
missed the
opinions.
suggestion.
I don't know if Tarek was being, or was really suggesting it or throwing it out like I threw out potato and carrot, but
Yeah,
minimum value was suggested.
Yeah.
Ah.
Because I mean the attribute name has length, so repeating length in the properties kind of yeah.
Yeah, I still think it strikes me as inconsistent compared to the existing length attributes, though.
Yeah, I agree. I prefer min length, max length.
Yeah, that's fine.
Minimum length, maximum length, and in this case, we bridge both the range attribute nomenclature and the length attribute nomenclature.
So there is already string length attribute, right? Which is surprisingly similar to this that we haven't looked at yet. And they go with maximum length and minimum length.
Well,
all right, done. Expand min and max.
Good catch, Stefan. Thank you.
okay, so final
and
two.
I do note none of these new things that you're suggesting are sealed. While the
No,
guidelines do
and-
say don't seal things, we do tend to seal attributes. Are you intentionally leaving them unsealed?
Yeah, and that's just following what is already happening in data annotations.
Alrighty.
Okay, so the final two, I guess, should be reviewed in tandem. So the one specifies an allow list, and the second one specifies a deny list. Where you basically just specify the things that you want or don't want in your values.
Where you're limited to things
You
that
are.
can be specified in attributes,
Of course.
not compile time constants, because
Yeah.
type. can
You
be
could, of
specified.
course, always derive that attribute and have pass whatever stuff you would like to see injected.
Sort of. That only works once you start going through that, and maybe this is already true for the whole validation space. Anything that works on hierarchy and implicitly changing values of properties beneath them in the hierarchy means it's not suitable to just using the non-runtime reflection model. So using metadata importer or anything, all you would see is that it's allowed points, and great, you don't know what that means.
But wait, can't I have an attribute that would say deny values between 5 and 10 that just derives from this attribute?
Well, it's once the constructor is doing work, right? So if deny 5 to 10 calls base with an array of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, that means everybody now needs to know what the implementation of that constructor is, which means it's only applicable to the runtime reflection model. It's not applicable to source generation or anything else based off reading metadata, which again, most of our attributes are designed for metadata reading, not for runtime reflection. These may
Should
already be
this-
special, and we already only care about the runtime execution model, but it's attributes, so I ask the questions.
Should this be a generic attribute? That way we can ensure all T are the same and also help restrict other potential edge cases and scenarios.
I asked that it work on .NET Framework.
But that T, can you actually enforce that T to match the type of the property you're applying the attribute to?
An analyzer could.
But you'd still need to do that validation. Of course, you get a guarantee that every element is of the same type, of course.
Right.
But I don't know.
Otherwise, users might think that implicit conversions or other things are expected to work, and
Yeah.
But that's if it needs to work on .NET Framework, then you can't use generic attributes.
I guess the
And,
other. Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
I think folks will expect those conversions to apply. Martin, your time span scenario kind of surfaces here of, we've minimum, maximum value of time spans and ranges of time spans. You can specify strings of them, and we do convert. So I think folks would expect that same conversion to occur here.
Made me realize the time span is not in this list. So what did we decide is the right choice for time span?
Your layer. Yeah, I don't. Yeah.
I don't recall we had this discussion, but it's been a while. So we made that decision, but ultimately it wasn't included in this list of APIs.
Okay, because that is one of our most commonly used out of these attributes.
And then do you want to be returning these as object array or read-only span of object? Because as object array, somebody using the runtime model can write back to it.
No, it's an attribute, so I don't know. If people do that, it's shame on them.
Fair enough. There are guidelines
guess
suggesting never having array-based properties because they're always a pain. So
that's fair. Like if you feel like it should be read-only span, I have no objection to that.
I mean, I'm asking the question. I don't actually have a strong opinion here.
I guess the other thing worth mentioning here is that input values will be matched against that array using some notion of equality, which is, I'm guessing, the equality encapsulated by the object being investigated. So in other words, using the dot equals method that the value you've deserialized is using.
Yeah,
So that
and
sounds
based on
controversial in any way.
things in one of our chat streams, I assume it's basically current value dot equal convert dot to type of the target type of the current value, and then whatever you give in, and that would be how you get the string to time span handling, assuming that that's actually registered in convert dot to type.
And I guess I'm intentionally steering away from any notion of somehow changing that equality. It would be baked in.
Right.
What do people think about making these generic?
Martin said he wanted them to work on .NET Framework, so he said no.
Either that or have two versions.
Not sure if Sharp has support for generic attributes yet. Yeah, it's not implemented yet.
So yeah, I mean, I think that these are going to be, somewhere between limited and exclusionary to non-runtime models. With if you try deriving it with types that aren't the things that you can specify as an attribute input, but
within R9 these aren't used a lot. It's I think we use it in a couple places with enums, so allow these enum values, but not these other ones, kind of thing.
Right, and those are allowed in attribute syntax, which is fine. It's just once you start getting into, oh, I want to use this, and I have a let's go back to point.
Yeah.
Like, only, the origin and, the unit vectors in any direction are allowed, and then you're like, okay, well, now you need a way of representing them that can make it through the attribute, and if you do it from a custom derived attribute, then that now means that metadata-based models won't have any idea what it's doing. So a source generator wouldn't be able to handle that.
Well, so that's not quite right. So in the source generator that we have, that I hope to discuss separately for option validation, instantiates the attribute types and then does the validation that way. So it could handle these kinds of cases.
Isn't that a no-no in source generator land?
What is?
Well, because that means you're depending on the runtime behavior of the framework version that the compiler is running, and not the runtime behavior of the framework that they're building for or would run on.
No, the source generator is generating code that creates an instance of the attribute, and then uses the instance of that attribute, calls the validate method or whatever it's called, is valid or something on the attribute object.
Right. So but
so
that means
all consistent.
Okay, but it's using the attribute at runtime. It's not using the attribute to make a decision at generation time.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So.
Yeah. So that's the only way to make this compose.
Right. So my statement there is that the source generator a source generation model couldn't look at allowed points and understand that, like, it's tuples of ints being specified pairwise, and right
is that a goal?
No, I'm saying that's a thing with attributes is generally when we have attributes, the things that are reading them never instantiate them. They're only reading metadata, and then that's why so popping back of why we have mandatory things are specified one way and optionals are the other, and we don't mix them, is so there's a single read model for all of these metadata based readers. And the way that this is setting itself up for suggesting that attributes be instantiated, which apparently is already true if the validation attribute has methods on it that get invoked, is not entirely consistent with other attributes we've looked at least in the last couple of years. But so I only bring it up as a concern, and if it's not a concern, then I think these are fine.
So the actual runtime behavior right now is there's a validation function that is invoked through reflection. So there's already room for these kinds of non-metadata semantics in the model.
Right. But things like the generated regex expression, that's the generator looks at that, throws away the attribute, or it read the data out of what was passed into the attribute, throws away the attribute, does a bunch of work. The attribute never gets instantiated unless somebody goes to the method and calls get all custom attributes. So.
Okay. Now, when I did the code generator and I started instantiating attribute, it felt strange. I gotta say.
Yeah. Because for the generators, generally they're a pragma that probably most people wish was so much of a pragma that it didn't show up in the runtime model. But we don't have only show the source generator this attribute to apply on attributes. So. Yeah. So does anybody have objections to these shapes? I questioned the object bracket, but didn't care about the answer, and I'm fine with array in as array out. I just wanted to ask the question.
So in the R9 version, we actually had. I wonder why we did this. We exposed an I collection of object instead of an array. I don't know why.
Is that just the array that's been upcast, or are you wrapping it?
No, it's just the array. Oh no, it's because we're actually taking the incoming array and turning that into a hash set. We expose the hash set so that then the isValid function can just do a contains call instead of scanning the array. No, that was the motivation. So you could, if you want to just return the array, you could still have a hash set internally.
Imo had a question in chat, just confirming that denies are processed last. So you first process allows, and then you process denies, so that way denies override any allows.
Well, as long as all validators have to agree, then it doesn't really matter what order you run them in.
Yeah, my expectation is that they should be mutually exclusive, but if people apply both on the same property, I guess we should ensure and document a certain order.
And I think specifically you want to do denies last, because if it's done for any kind of security reasons or anything else, denies are generally supposed to win out.
Right, but if the deny returning invalid shuts down the pipeline, then it seems like you want it to run first. I just don't like.
Right, but
does the pipeline shut down at the first failure or at the last one?
Yeah, are allowed values supposed to be the complete set?
Yeah,
like they are, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is order independent. So there's some value in the field. Yeah. Either it's allowed or not, and then either it's denied or not, and it doesn't.
Yes, but what if the user specifies allowed 5, 3, 2, and then denied 5?
Yeah, so the allowed will say, yep, no problem, and the denied will say, nope, I reject.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter which order you evaluate that in. Right, so this is strictly a everybody needs to agree that this value is correct.
Yeah, it's the and of all the validators. So the order wouldn't matter unless it's a short-circuiting false, in which case, honestly, it doesn't matter. But the problem when comparing it with something like Windows ACLs in saying that the order matters is because they say when the first time a rule matches, they bail, and so they have to start with denieds.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's not the case here.
So if we're done with this set, I would like to talk a few minutes about time span, because I'm wondering how do I turn my 51 uses of time span attributes into something.
Yeah, Jeremy, if you expand the original API proposal block at the end, you'll see a time span attribute a bit further up. Yeah, that's the one. That's the one.
So it's like a range attribute, and we had support for exclusive mode or inclusive, so less than 10 seconds or more than 10 seconds, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the motivation for that is that there's no easy way to specify ranges for types whose literals can't be specified in attributes. You can, but you basically need to do a type of, the thing that you want to compare, and then provide a string format for the lower bound and the upper bound, which is kind of awkward. that's already exposed as a separate constructor in range attribute. So this essentially provides an accelerator for specifying ranges in time span. And my kind of misgivings about this one is that it's specifically biased towards measuring time spans in milliseconds, which makes sense if you're like doing platform engineering or validating for latencies. But from my experience, I wouldn't expect time spans to be always measured in milliseconds, especially if you're doing some form of domain logic.
Well, and then there's the string overloads that lets you specify a fully elaborate time span,
which you could still do with the existing range attribute class, though.
Yeah, you just need to do the type of ugliness.
So can't just the range attribute just be used in this scenario? I mean, like you have time span .text and passing.
You can't have in an attribute things that aren't primitives. So you can't like new up a time span.
Right, but this constructor on range attribute looks like you can say range attribute type of time span and then a string form of the minimum and a string form of the maximum.
Right, which is also potentially more expensive if there's a lot of these. Because then you have to parse out the time span versus simply converting the milliseconds or the minutes or the etc.
But that's a price you only pay once when you initialize the attribute. I mean, it's still a concern. I think the main thing is the inconvenience of using that constructor, because mistakes could be made when formatting the value you're interested in.
Yeah, so I guess I'm
so we're
not
in the
clear.
end, we're talking about just fewer characters to type in. That's really what it boils down to.
Yeah. So are we actually like, because this wasn't part of the proposal? Are we trying to bolt it onto the proposal right now?
I think this needs a bit of work from my perspective.
Yeah. So there was a good observation in chat that you're missing a word here, which is time span range attribute or something else. You're not a time span. You're specifying a range of time spans.
That's fair.
And basically, you're just trying to be range attribute, but special case handling for time span. So time span range seems to make the most sense, but yeah.
Okay, so I guess we should come back later then.
Yeah.
Okay, and I haven't heard any delayed extra concerns about allowed and denied, and if they're going in text chat, you need to have an advocate speak up for you because I can only read one of the two chats and I pick YouTube. So, oh, and YouTube chat asks, is null a legal value in the allowed and denied values attributes? I assume it would be.
Null is, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I guess that raises the question whether we should update the nullability annotations for that object array.
If you are being net standard somewhere, you don't have nullability annotations. They're only net core, I think. And nobody's telling me I'm wrong. So.
I mean,
no, we use nullable annotations all over the place in code that's consumed by .NET older frameworks.
So is that true if you cross compile, or is it just something to do with like referencing? I mean, they're different, right?
So the code is compiled with a modern framework, with a modern SDK, but it's consumable by legacy frameworks. Not.
Have we reached a conclusion on whether we need the properties to be a read-only span of object?
I mean, I asked the question and nobody else cared, so I'm fine leaving him as object array in and object array out.
Okay.
Yeah, would it be cleaner actually to make it actually a read-only collection of object? Question mark.
The array is actually going to be encoded in metadata as an array. So and like any collection you could create would be backed by an array. So I don't think there'd be any benefit to doing so.
Okay.
What happens when
Yeah.
people try to modify the array?
Well, right. So if you're going to return an read-only collection, you have to wrap the array in something that's going to prevent mutation.
Yeah.
Because we don't. We say it's bad design to say I'm read-only, and then somebody can just cast it away, because our notion of breaking changes are if somebody could have always done a hard cast and it succeeded, you can't break that in the future.
Just it's a semantic indication to the reader of what this is expected. Even if you, right, it's just...
Right, and we don't do that. We say if you have a mutable thing, return it as mutable, and if you call it an immutable thing, then you have to wrap it in something else to prevent the mutation. We don't do decoration only.
Generally
In general.
speaking, we try to keep attribute implementations simple as well. So just returning the thing you were passed is good enough.
Exactly, and yeah. So
Yeah.
again, going
Yeah,
with
just
generally we
these-
use
these
attributes for metadata, and not.
It's just these attributes are different, like we discussed before, right? And they... So...
Yeah.
Right, but then we also
Right,
have
so
to-
in particular, in practice, the implementation of this should be storing the values in a hash set.
Yeah, you mean for optimizing the validation implementation.
Right.
But I would expect that this would be an internal implementation detail rather than something we should be exposing to users.
I agree, but it means now this you'll be storing that data twice, once in the collection and once in an array. That's all.
right, but if a user is specifying this attribute and they specify 5 twice, then it will be encoded in IL with that 5 twice. There's no opportunity to trim it. You can, when instantiating it from reflection, trim it down, but that's
Yes.
then just an implementation detail.
Correct. So what I was suggesting as an implementation is inside of the constructor for this type, you consume the array and you inject it into the hash table. And then when somebody queries give me the set of available values, they get the values out of the hash table, out of the hash set.
How would
I
you
think
do
the
that given you don't know the
implementation-
type? Like, are you just being hash set of object, which is
That's
probably
what we have today. Yeah, hash set of objects.
I would probably say that these properties are meant to kind of surface what has been declared on the attribute itself, rather than provide an optimized view that's meant to be used for the validation. I think these should be kept separate, even if they end up duplicating data. And it also means that if you specify like a couple of values, hash set isn't probably the best thing to be using when validating.
Mhm.
And that means that we should be free to use whatever representation we want internally for the validator itself.
I mean, in general, for attributes, you want to keep the constructor as lean as possible, because these things get constructed anytime you reflect over types and you enumerate the attributes. They get instantiated. You wouldn't want someone walking over that to end up in doing all the hash table computation.
Basically, the is valid should lazy create the hash set if the length supports moving to a hash set instead of just doing a. Because if you only have one item in allowed values, then doing a for each is obviously better than a hash set.
Yeah.
Somewhere there's a threshold. I picked one because I know which side it wins on.
What does the getter return though?
Whatever was
Cool.
passed in the input.
And then when people modify it,
They get non-deterministic behavior because presumably the first call to the is valid will have maybe done something that no longer respects modification on the array. Again, this is weird because they're all attributes, and in general, our attributes are read by metadata readers.
We don't take that stance for any other object, any other array property, right? Every other array property has to be like a clone in case somebody modifies it.
I think we're different on attributes, though.
Yeah, so attributes aren't singletons, right? So the only way you get them is by effectively calling into reflection, and they give you a new instance every time, right? So if you lick it afterwards, I mean, you own it, right? So it's your problem. And if somebody else, I mean, this is, I guess, the problem. You shouldn't expose raw attributes as singletons, right? Which I guess is happening here because you use them for data validation. But I think we have many other attributes that return raw arrays because they are special in the way that, we can't really accept custom collection types, and so we kind of want to return what you gave us, and so it kind of results in, we can give you back an I-read-only list or something, but that's kind of weird, so it just comes down to we don't care for attributes. Which is not a great answer, but that's I think that's just where the framework has always been.
Yeah, I'm trying to find one that has a params attribute.
I mean, in a perfect world, if we could redesign the entire library, I probably wouldn't design it around attributes. I would probably have a rule engine, and then the attributes just called into the rule engine. But you can also use the rule engine itself directly without having to instantiate the attributes to have the validation working. And then you don't have that problem, I guess. But that goes back to we don't have a TARDIS.
Filter UI hit.
One that I found was tuple element names attribute. Takes a string array and then exposes it as iList. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think if you look at the implementation, we probably just cast the array.
Yeah, we do.
Which
so you can totally mutate it.
Well, it's iList as well, so.
Yeah, you can try to add, which is funny now. we can't let you add, but
yeah, that'll throw because the object throws. But
yeah, exactly.
I have no idea why they picked iList for that.
I think somebody had a similar conversation we had, and they decided to compromise as iList. Which I guess is not a great answer either.
Yeah, so for member not null attribute, sorry, not null win, we just array in, array out.
Yeah, that's a recent one. Yeah, also the compiler one, the nullable attribute that the compiler synthesizes, same thing. It has a byte array. Well, I like cookies. The analogy worked for cookies.
Yeah. All right. So so chat asks a reasonable question about comparers for the allowed and denied values. I assume since we're in attribute land, there's not a really good way of doing it unless we took a type.
I don't feel that exposing an additional constructor overload is worth it, especially given that it's I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the fact that all of this validation engine seems dependent on runtime behavior, it's somebody should just make a custom validation attribute for their own types if they need a custom comparator.
The values that you you can't pass into these attributes are going to be really simple anyways. So like if you have like a customized equality requirement for simple values, then build your own validation attribute, I guess, is the answer.
So all of your types are not sealed. Is that intentional?
Yes. And that's because all the other types in that library are not sealed either. And I guess that's by design. The idea is that people can extend these attributes and, pass in things that couldn't be passed on the attribute declaration level.
I'm not sure I follow. I mean, you can always instantiate them by hand, right, to do that. But I guess you're saying that, for custom types, you would have your own parsing logic then, basically?
Yeah, if you want to decorate a property with an attribute, but the value that needs to be passed into that constructor cannot be specified, typically your best course of action is to inherit from that attribute and create that value yourself, or create a proxy value that is supported in attributes.
And that's kind of the discussion we had about time span, right? But it's probably not a great story because now just to support one type, you have to extend like 12 attributes or something. Right?
Yeah, I think there might actually be a bit of design space. I have a few ideas here about how we could make things easier so that at least users don't need to specify their bounds as string literals. I think there might be ways, but it's probably not the place to share these ideas.
Is there a concern, Emil, to have it not sealed?
Well, I mean, we generally seal attributes because the intent is that people don't really inherit them, and it's cheaper at runtime, right? Because when you ask for attributes for a given type, they don't have to walk the inheritance chain. So we generally say don't seal. We generally say seal attributes.
Well, and
it's also more friendly to source gen, right?
Right, and going back to the source generation and other metadata-based approaches that are generally what we've been doing with attributes is that means that the source generator doesn't need to ask every attribute what is the inheritance model. It's
exactly.
is this the word I'm looking for? Yes or no is the check. But this whole space is using attributes at runtime, which makes them all different than every other attribute. Yeah. Reflection's always supported it, just I don't know of other places that are somewhat core that we actually instantiate attributes and look at them at runtime.
I mean, that was the model in V1. In fact, WinForms is full of that. Like the entire designer extensibility of Visual Studio is based on the idea that you instantiate attribute and call weird methods on them that are virtual and all of that.
Fair enough. We seem to have moved away from that, though.
Well, I mean, we have moved away from every place where we don't have to. for things like extensibility, well, that's kind of the point. So I guess that's what we did there. And that's the same here, right? I'm just not sure how I guess for time span it would be sensible, right? But things like required attribute, I don't know what you would do with that if you could extend it. But I guess that ship has sailed already.
Yeah. YouTube chat asks, should allowed values attribute allowed values just be called values? And similarly for denied values.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
It's reasonable. I can't believe it took us 2 hours to get to this point, though. It looked so innocent.
As usually happens.
The easier it looks, the harder it is? No, because the harder it looks, the harder it is. Everything's hard. That's the lesson. Everything's hard.
Well, I think the problem here is the semantics, right? Because they all have behavior behind them that is not necessarily trivial.
Yep. And Yeah, so all the attribute usages looked consistent with the other data validation things, so I'll just assume
I
they're
think
all
Jeff
right.
was involved with the V1 design of this, so if he seemed okay with it, so
Yeah.
he did not immediately throw up, so that, I guess that's a good sign.
All right, everybody happy?
Ish.
Everybody happy is as happy as they expect to get?
I can get behind that.
Maximal happiness has been attained. Going once, going twice. Approved.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. For the other 3 items that were listed on the agenda, I'm sorry, but I note that it is lunchtime. We have gone beyond time, and I am really, really hungry. So,
Thursday one would be for other topic, right? I mean,
Thursday is already dedicated to the IEEE decimal stuff. So I assume everything that we
the other
punted
things
from now is
can
next
wait
Tuesday.
until Tuesday, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, if we really need to close on them this week, we can switch and just push decimal to Tuesday, but it seems like it's a toss-up.
I think it's fine. Anyway.
Yeah. Decimal's one where it is large, but it is also
Easy.
It's potentially easy because there's no new concepts. Basically, it's going to be here's a rundown of what the decimal types are. Here's the things that are unique to decimal that you don't find in the other kind of primitive types. And then here's a big API list that says here's what we're going to provide, and it fits the interfaces we've already defined for other primitive numeric types. So it's potentially something where we go over the concepts, a few questions are answered, and it's done. It could also take the full 2 hours. Who knows?
I mean, if Tanner is going to be there, it might take 2 hours. No, I'm joking, but yeah, I already looked over it, so as you said, it seems mostly just rinse and repeat from what we already have, so it should be somewhat straightforward.
Yeah.
Alrighty, then I see all of you on. No, actually, I won't be there on Thursday for at least half the meeting.
That's what you said about today.
That's what I said about today. Today I lied. Maybe I lied Thursday too. I hope not.
Okay, try to lie on Thursday.
All right. Well, thanks everyone online for joining us, and if you joined us not live, well, thanks for joining us anyway, and see you at our normal .NET time on our same .NET channel.
Thanks, everyone.